So this this past week has sort of made me maybe rethink what I'm going to talk about. Not really. It's still going to fall in the same scope, I think, of what I was going to talk about originally, but I'm just sort of starting at a different place now. If you don't know much of anything about it, or maybe even if you think you probably know too much about it, I don't know. The conflict in the Middle East this past week has been the cause of a lot of consideration, and I'm not going to talk on it specifically because I think it's out there. If people want to know more about it and have a sincere and legitimate want to know more about it, there's plenty online to look at and to see for yourself, and a lot of it will not be easy to watch. But it got me thinking, based on the reaction, that unfortunately I have to say I'm only so surprised by. To an extent, I'm not all that surprised, though it hurts me to say that, based on the general or a rather typical university reaction to what has been going on in the Middle East regarding Israel and Gaza and the surrounding Arab nations. And there is a complete detachment in the way that two sides of people see this issue. Complete different realities. And I'm not necessarily going to talk on the specific situation itself, but there is a correlation, I think, to the quote-unquote thought leaders in our own American society and what they have to say about this, and it got me thinking on my own position on that situation, on how people who are supposed to be exemplars of some sort of intelligent perspective, who are well-read, very articulate individuals who end up taking sides on something and who end up saying things about something that blows the mind of what I would call an average person who has been given the data without bias and ends up on polar ends of this situation. And again, I'm not going to speak specifically to it, but I am going to talk about how I think we've gotten to this point. And it's a point that needs to be talked about, and a lot of people don't seem to be doing it, at least not in the way that I think that we should. And so I'm going to start with, we're going to talk about a book that C.S. Lewis wrote. This is not a Christian apologetics book. This is not a fantasy book, and this is not literary criticism, which are the three main things that he wrote about. This is a book called The Abolition of Man. It's a very small book, and it is, I think, the most important book that was written in the 20th century. And I don't say that lightly. It's important because it walks us through what I think has been the central issue between our education system and the ideas that permeate the people who go into college and who come out feeling as if they are more open-minded and have thought through things and have reached this point of relative enlightenment on situations, and who now feel themselves to be legitimate spokespersons for issues. And then when I hear their opinions, I am baffled by the utter separation from a traditional perspective of ethics, of morality, of history, of politics. And I'm not necessarily blaming any of these people, though I do disagree with many of them, a lot of them. I'm blaming the educational structure that has allowed it to take place. And so this book, The Abolition of Man, there are only 3 chapters in it. And the point of the book, it's essentially a work of ethics. It is not Christian ethics. It is just ethics, plain and simple. It's trying to make an argument for, well, so the book it starts with, Lewis talks about how he was given an elementary textbook, and it was passed out to a bunch of the Oxford Dons, of which he was one, and he started reading bits of it, and it suggested to him, or it reinforced to him, that there is something going on with our educational system that demands to be talked about, because if we don't, there are going to be dire repercussions. And I think that we've seen the fruit of those dire repercussions. And essentially what he says is, he doesn't say the book name. He wants to protect the authors to an extent, because the 2 authors are not intending to do what Lewis is saying that it will inevitably do to the children who are reading this, or to the teachers who teach it to their students. So he decides to protect their names, their anonymity to an extent, but he wants to talk about what it is that they're doing. And he calls his book The Green Book, and he gives pseudonyms for the 2 men, Gaius and Titius. And, such classical names. Classic Lewis. But anyway, so he gives them these names. And essentially what this book did is it gives this, it's trying to walk the student through their English prep, trying to teach all this stuff. And at one point in the book, it talks about this famous scene where Taylor Coleridge, an English poet, famous poet, had gone to a waterfall. And he hears 2 tourists talking back and forth about the waterfall. And one of them says, "This waterfall is pretty." The other one says, "This waterfall is sublime." And Coleridge has this response to where he knows the person who said this waterfall is sublime is right. Or at least they are more right than the person who says that it is merely pretty. And what Gaius and Titius do is they give this scene, and then they begin to expound on this and say, see, what Coleridge thought he was doing is that he thought he was talking about the legitimacy of the waterfall as an objective thing. And that when he thought he was thinking, or when he thought he was responding to the waterfall being sublime, what he actually meant was, I have sublime feelings about this waterfall. And Lewis, at that moment, sort of has a light bulb, and he goes, "I'm sorry, what?" So I thought this book was a book about English prep, about trying to teach a student how to tell if something is well written, poorly written, what good writing is, what bad writing is. And somehow they're doing this by suggesting to the person reading it that the emotions or reaction to this waterfall is merely psychological self-speaking, essentially. I have feelings about this thing, so this is why I call it sublime, but I don't actually mean it's sublime. I mean that I have sublime feelings about this thing. And so what Gaius and Titius have essentially done in this and in multiple different scenarios, this is the main example that Lewis uses when he's talking about this, they have essentially, not through argument, not through reason, not through any conscious move to get to this position, they have merely slipped in this idea that there is no such thing as legitimate objective value given to a thing. It is all our own psychology. It is all our own internal viewpoint. And so they have slipped in this assumption of pure subjectivity in the world, and they have not even given the student the option to maybe, push back a little bit or ask questions. It is just, and there is an assumption. You don't believe this? You don't think that when Coleridge is saying this, he's merely just reacting to sublime feelings that he has about the waterfall? And of course not. His position is, it is a thing that objectively merits a certain kind of approval, or as the case may be, disapproval. It is in fact him assuming objectivity in the world, and Gaius and Odysseus are essentially assuming the opposite and dropping it in there. And then over time, the student, assuming Gaius and Odysseus aren't the only ones doing this, which I can say in my own educational background, they are far from the only ones who have attempted and who have done this and succeeded at it. You drop these little flippant and subtle assumptions about how the way the world works. And if the student is not thinking to themselves, let me actually wrestle with this, let me ask questions about this, and let me push back on this to test the validity of it, then they're just going to take it. And what we've done is essentially we've created two types of people coming out of universities. We've created people who just sort of take what's been given to them. You know, they have these, everyone's got their biases. They come in with certain biases about something, and the professors have their own background, and I'm assuming they've gone through this experience as well, where people have sort of dropped these assumptions about how the way the world works, and they just get built up in that, and then they come and they make these assumptions to the students, and the students just take it, because why not? And you only end up with a small minority of people who come into it with an opposing viewpoint, myself among them. And what I used to do is when I would go into class, I enjoyed doing this more than I should have. I think I have come to the realization, and many of people, anybody who really knows me knows this about me, I like to argue. I like to push back, and I'm a difficult person. I'm a very difficult person because I am always second guessing what somebody is telling me. My assumption is you're trying to pull one over on me. And I have to convince myself through how you talk about something that you're not actually doing that. And if I cannot convince myself that you are not trying to pull one over on me or that you don't actually know what you're talking about, I'm going to continue to push and push and push. And if you don't have that, if you don't assume that what people are telling you may not be right and that you want to decide the truth of it, and that's a concept that has been whittled away to the point where people now don't even believe that truth as a concept exists. And this book is essentially using this as a jumping point and going, let's consider this and let's actually figure out where this goes, because there are some ramifications down the line if we don't deal with this now. And so Lewis takes that and he jumps into this elaboration of, throughout history, people have assumed to an extent an objective reality to the universe. Meaning when we say, that scene is beautiful, we don't mean I have beautiful feelings about that scene. We mean that we are making, whether or not we acknowledge it consciously, we are making an assumption that that scene is objectively beautiful and it deserves to be considered as beautiful. And if you don't see it as beautiful, then there's something off with you. There is an assumption that reality as a concept, as a thing in and of itself exists, and that we need to adjust ourselves to meet reality. And what Lewis is essentially saying is that over time we've flipped this. We've now demanded that reality adhere to our own perception. And by our own philosophy, our own perception is purely subjective, which means that everyone has their own little universe that they revolve, that they have, and that you have your own little universe. And Lewis sort of comes in and says that the vast history of humanity has fundamentally denied this, but somehow we have somehow ripped this out of ourselves. And this is the way that he thinks that it's been done, is that people just come in and make assumptions. We have not done it by rational argument, because to do so is essentially any argument that you bring to the table to demolish the objectivity of this ends up demolishing itself. This is essentially the argument that he's making, but there's a lot to it. And so with this video, I just wanted to sort of do an entry point into this and and I may do this as a 3-part series because I think this is something that needs to be considered. But Lewis comes in and makes the argument that uh, this is what education is becoming, first of all, that people are slipping in these things into it, and the student who's getting it does not realize that all of theology, all of philosophy, all of politics, all of ethics, how they see the universe is all at stake in these assumptions that are being presented in educational textbooks that are purporting, in this instance, to teach English, to teach grammar, to teach what makes good and bad writing. And somehow they've pulled this in there. And this is far from the only example. Again, having gone through the educational program, I saw it absolutely everywhere. And only somebody who second guesses everything that they are fed. And I'm not trying to build myself up, I'm just saying that everybody should be doing this. And so many people are not. Second guess everything that you are fed. Not, and this is important, not just the things that you want to second guess being fed, which means recognize your own biases, second guess your biases, but realize that even people on the other side who agree with you have their own biases as well. So if you find yourself naturally gravitating toward a certain way of viewing things, question yourself. Constantly ask yourself, am I going in the right direction? Is this true? If you're not asking yourself all the time, is this true? Or if you don't even acknowledge that truth as a concept exists, there is no hope. I'm sorry, there is no hope. You become completely moldable by the general spirit of the age. And there's a term, zeitgeist, that is used to define a spirit of any particular age and society. It is obvious that these things exist because there is movement in how people act and how people think about things. And there is a fashion of ideas that people naturally gravitate to. And if you're not second guessing yourself, always asking, is this fashionable idea true? Then you're lost. There's no way to fight propaganda at that point, because you don't know what's real anymore. You don't even acknowledge almost that reality exists. And so this is an important issue that needs to be talked about. But the main thing is that we're mainly seeing this at universities. We're mainly seeing this in people who have gone to college and come out, who seem to have had something ripped out of them that was their only chain to a legacy of humanity, that only quote unquote average normal people for the most part seem to be able to relate to anymore. And so something is off, and we find ourselves now, I very much assume that none of us would deny this, we now have two sides, and there's a lot of nuance in between each one, but we essentially have two sides that live in different realities. We essentially see a color, and one says it's red, one says it's blue. We see a color, one says it's black, one says it's white. We're cognitively at odds with each other. And this is C.S. Lewis's argument. This book is walking us through why this may be the case. And objective versus subjective seems to be a very central point on this. And before I jump in a little bit more, I will sort of preface by saying, I do believe that there was this, that we have, through analysis, constantly pulled and disentangled things. And in doing that, we have created this sort of objective versus subjective, this other versus self. We've created a lot of dichotomies that reason would assent to, but cognitive humanity has not always had to grapple with. I don't think that we were wrestling with objectivity versus subjectivity until we had constantly kept sort of analyzing reality, defining what it is in our place in it and how we correlate to it. But when we did that, it was apparent to everyone that there is a tangible reality, and we are trying to work in response to it, not the other way around, not trying to mold reality to suit ourselves. And we seem to be on that lane now. We seem to be doing that. And so, so that out of the way, there's a phrase used in this book, and this is essentially one of the most famous quotes from it is um, when he's talking about we have removed the chest of people. We have pulled out their chests. We no longer have men with chests, is how he says it. And a lot of people sort of take that like, yeah, we need, yeah, he means we need to get back our oomph. We need to get manly. We're becoming feminized. That is not what he means. What he's talking about when he's talking about a chest is and he uses a few different words for this. He's referencing, you know, older writers when he's doing this, and he's correlating them across cultures and across time, that there is this middle element. We have our intelligence, we have our spiritual natures, and this is classically speaking, and we have our animal natures. We have our intellect and our reason and our soul connecting us to something higher, and we have our animal bodies, our animal urges, our things, material about us that drive how we act and think. And they're supposed to be connected by this middle element that he calls the chest. Others have called the, seat of magnanimity and all these cool little terms, but it's the middle point of a person. It is where the two parts of our very being meet. And it's actually very intricate how this works and how historically thinkers have seen this. But it essentially works in the way that this is where our ability to perceive virtue, our ability to perceive morality, and our ability to enact it resides. And so this central point, this middle point, is what education used to instill in its students and build up. It was like parents with children. It wasn't like a state with moldable humans, which is essentially what we're becoming and have become. It was initiating, it was trying to train these emotions in a child to like the things that they ought to like and to dislike the things that they ought to dislike. That was what education meant. And through all these efforts, they were being initiated, in a sense, into the mystery of humanity. They were being brought up in the way that the parents, the teachers, were brought up themselves. They were passing along, they were initiating. We don't essentially do that anymore. We don't treat education to be, and this is something Aristotle said, that was how he defined education: to like what you ought and to dislike what you ought. These are the things that we need to teach through education. That is what it meant. And we have changed that to where essentially the state is the one in control of all of it. They no longer initiate. What they do is they essentially utilize propaganda to create in little humans the way, the desired little human that they want them to be. And it cannot be said, I'm assuming people would agree with this, that what the parent who is initiating their children into humanity, into trying to build up the proper emotions to control their animal natures and their negative natures, and by the assent of reason, realizing how the emotions are supposed to operate and help us attain virtue and live virtuous lives and be good people to other people. Reason assents to how we do this, and in assenting to how it does this, by the joining of this emotional, this proper situation or this proper organization of attitudes, emotionally driven and reasonably assented to, helps to control our animal nature. And education, in having shifted, has demolished that. You're not doing that anymore. And so, and if it's being done, it's not being done in schools. We don't agree anymore on how to initiate children because we can't agree on what humanity is, on how humanity operates, on what is good and what is bad. So we leave it up to the state to dictate these things. And then they churn out these people who have gone through this and have been given assumptions, largely, not arguments, and have essentially molded us in a certain way. And if we are not constantly asking ourselves, is it true? There is no corrective. We essentially just keep going and going and going in our own intellectual instincts, because our intelligence also has instincts. Our instincts just sort of push us where they want to go. Like if we have not routinely had the situation where we have been forced by reason to believe something that we wish were not true, then we can pretty much be well certain that our biases is directing everything that we believe. And so, yeah, the educational system has created it to where now we do have two different worlds. We have people who are being initiated, and then we have people who are created, in a sense, who have no attachment to a legacy of humanity. And then over here, we have people who have been brought up in this way. And there's small disagreements, relatively speaking, over here. But now we have two different worlds. We have two realities, and we don't know how to communicate between the two of us. I find myself on the side, more traditionally speaking, because I think it is hubris in us to assume that we have reached a place where we can demolish everything that came before and to set up something else. And I'm going to get into the implications of that. If not in my next video, then in the third video, because again, there were 3 chapters in his book. This was mainly the introductory, the first chapter, to explain the ideas and the notions and the broad environment that we find ourselves in. And yeah, so it's, at the end of the day, the book is, and what I'm going to be talking about is an argument to return to the initiative, or the initiative process, I suppose one might say, initiating process, to build back in us a chest that we have had cut out of us. We don't have any correlation anymore between our animal and our spiritual selves. A lot of people on the sort of more secular side would deny that we even have spiritual selves, or if they don't, it's always some sort of half-muddied, more Eastern idea or Platonic idea of, and that's its own thing. That's something that we can certainly argue about and talk about and grapple with. But as it is, the educational system has created a lot of people who essentially just churn out the same stuff that everybody else is saying. And I think that we've essentially, we're not even talking about substantial things anymore. We're just like creating words to refer to vague concepts, and we continue to remove ourselves from reality to the point to where all we are, or all we become, are these little analytical robots in fog. We don't have anything substantial in reality to ground us anymore, and we need to reground this. We need assumptions about objectivity. If we can't even get that far, then again, we're all an island. We're all our own authority, and if we're all our own authority, then nobody's an authority, essentially. Yeah, so I'm going to stop it there, because it's going to cut me off if I don't. And yeah, I'll jump into video 2 hopefully next week, and we'll go from there. Hope you've enjoyed it. Peace.